The Galactic Tribunal Chamber was the kind of place designed to make you feel small. Soaring, crystalline walls stretched upward into infinity, or at least what passed for infinity when you were dealing with architects who thought subtle intimidation was achieved through sheer vertical excess. The lighting cast everything in that particular shade of blue that screamed, "We are very serious and very important, and you should be very afraid." Commander Casey Morgan sat in the defendant's chair, looking about as impressed as someone ordering coffee at a particularly pretentious cafe. Which is to say, not at all. The chair itself was another masterstroke of psychological warfare, uncomfortable metal that somehow managed to be both too large and too small simultaneously. Casey had solved this problem by slouching in a way that would have made her old drill sergeant weep, one leg hooked over the armrest, chin propped on her hand like she was waiting for a particularly boring movie to get to the good parts. "Commander Casey Morgan of the Human Colonial Fleet," Ambassador Theximore announced, their voice carrying that particular nasal quality that made every word sound like a complaint about the service at an expensive restaurant. The Zephyrian's 6 arms gesticulated in perfect synchronization, a talent that would have been impressive if it weren't being used to point accusingly at a woman who looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else. "You stand accused of crimes against galactic civilization, violations of the Interstellar Warfare Conventions, and—" The pause here was clearly meant to be dramatic. "Genocide." Casey examined her fingernails. They were perfectly manicured, which was somewhat surprising considering she'd spent the last 18 months doing things that typically weren't conducive to nail care. "That's a pretty big word there, Ambassador. You sure you're using it right?" The courtroom, and really, calling it a courtroom was generous when it was more like a theater designed by someone who'd only ever heard theaters described by a particularly depressed alien, erupted in what could charitably be called murmurs of displeasure. Less charitably, it sounded like a bunch of very important people having simultaneous digestive issues. General Vask of the Hegemony stood up, which was always a production when you were dealing with a species that resembled what would happen if a rhinoceros decided to cosplay as a filing cabinet. "The defendant shows no remorse for her actions. She destroyed an entire Krillian battle fleet." "Did I?" Casey asked, genuinely curious. "Huh. Memory's a bit fuzzy. Remind me, what exactly constitutes destroyed in your book?" This was the point where a normal defendant might have been shaking with terror, or at least pretending to take the proceedings seriously. Casey Morgan was not a normal defendant. Casey Morgan was the kind of person who, when faced with impossible odds and certain death, typically responded by checking her watch and wondering if she'd have time to grab lunch afterward. The prosecutor, a being that looked like someone had tried to build a lawyer out of spare tentacles and ambient smugness, slithered forward with a data pad that probably cost more than most planets' annual defense budgets. "The evidence is irrefutable. The Krillian fleet of 200 vessels vanished from all sensors during the Battle of the Neutral Zone. No survivors, no wreckage, no trace." "Well," Casey said, settling back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone about to deliver a punchline 18 months in the making, "I suppose that depends on how you define survivors, doesn't it?" The narrator's voice, if such a thing existed in this particular corner of the universe, would have noted at this point that Commander Casey Morgan had a gift for dramatic timing that was wasted on the military, and really should have been applied to either theater or high-stakes poker. Possibly both. Administrator Kell, whose species had evolved from something that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a tax auditor, leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone who smelled blood in the water. "Are you confessing to genocide, Commander?" Casey's laugh was the kind that made enemy soldiers reconsider their life choices. It was neither loud nor particularly long, but it carried the sort of confidence that suggested she knew something everyone else didn't. Which, as it happened, she did. "Oh, Administrator," she said, shaking her head with the fond exasperation typically reserved for children who insisted that vegetables were made of poison. "You really don't understand humans at all, do you?" The silence that followed was the kind that happens right before something very expensive explodes. "Let me tell you a story," Casey continued, completely ignoring the fact that this was supposed to be a formal legal proceeding and not story time at the Galactic Library. "It's about what happens when you mistake human mercy for human weakness. It's about what happens when you confuse our reluctance to fight with our inability to win. And it's about what happens when you're so busy looking for war crimes that you miss the real crime entirely." She stood up, which should have been impossible given that the defendant's chair was equipped with restraint fields that could hold a rampaging Arcturian battle rhino. The fact that the restraints weren't even activated said something about either the tribunal's confidence or their stupidity. Given recent events, smart money was on the latter. "See, the thing about war crimes," Casey said, beginning to pace in that casual way that made seasoned warriors reach for weapons they didn't have, "is that they require a war. And what we had with the Krillians—" She paused, tilting her head like she was trying to remember something particularly amusing. "Well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a fair fight. Ambassador Thexmore's 6 arms began what could only be described as aggressive interpretive dance. The Krillian Dominion was one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. Their fleet had conquered 18 systems. Had being the operative phrase there, Ambassador." Casey's smile was the kind that made hardened criminals confess to crimes they didn't commit, mostly because they figured whatever they'd actually done couldn't possibly be worse than what that smile suggested she was thinking about. "But I'm getting ahead of myself. You want to hear about war crimes? Fine. Let me tell you about the real war crime." She turned to face the gallery, where representatives from 43 different species sat in judgment, each convinced of their own moral superiority, and each about to discover that moral superiority was a luxury they couldn't afford. "The real war crime," Casey said, her voice carrying the kind of casual authority that made generals nervous and politicians reach for their lawyers, "was that I let them live." The courtroom erupted into chaos, which was actually an improvement over the previous atmosphere of smug self-righteousness. Casey waited for the noise to die down, which it eventually did, mostly because even outraged aliens eventually had to breathe. "But I suppose I should start at the beginning," she continued, settling back into her chair with the air of someone settling in for a particularly good book. "Back when you all still thought humans were just another species of peaceful farmers who'd roll over and die quietly when the real predators came calling." She looked directly at Ambassador Thexmore, and her smile took on the quality of a shark that had just spotted a particularly slow swimmer. "Back when you thought we were the kind of species that could be ignored." 18 months earlier, the galaxy had been a much more predictable place. Species conquered other species, the strong preyed upon the weak, and everyone understood the rules. It was a comfortable sort of brutality, the kind that allowed civilized beings to sleep soundly, knowing that somewhere else, someone else, was having a very bad day. Then humanity had gone and ruined everything by refusing to follow the script. "The first mistake," Casey said, her voice carrying the tone of someone explaining a particularly obvious math problem to a room full of people who'd somehow gotten confused by basic addition, "was assuming that humans were like everyone else in this galaxy. that we'd roll over and show our bellies the moment someone bigger came along. The tribunal shifted uncomfortably. When you've spent millennia being either the predator or the prey, the concept of a third option tends to make people nervous. Ambassador William Hayes, Casey continued, and there was genuine fondness in her voice now, the kind reserved for well-meaning relatives who insist on using technology they don't understand. Bless his optimistic heart. Actually believed in diplomacy. Poor bastard. Spent 6 months putting together the most beautiful first contact package you've ever seen. Cultural exchanges, trade agreements, mutual defense pacts. The works. She paused, and her expression took on the quality of someone remembering a particularly good joke that had ended badly. The Krillians responded by glassing 3 of our colonies and enslaving 2.3 million humans. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone in the room suddenly remembers they left something very important on fire somewhere else. Now, I know what you're thinking, Casey said, addressing the tribunal with the patience of a teacher who'd long since given up on her students ever passing the final exam. You're thinking, well, that's just how these things go. The strong take from the weak, and the weak learn to accept their place. It's a very civilized way of looking at mass murder and slavery, really. Very sophisticated. General Vask made a sound that might have been a cough, or might have been the noise a filing cabinet makes when it's trying to express moral indignation. The Krillian Dominion was following standard colonial expansion protocols. Standard, Casey repeated, savoring the word like it was a particularly fine wine that had just revealed itself to be vinegar. Right, and your response to this standard colonial expansion was what, exactly? Let me guess. Strongly worded letters? Economic sanctions? A very stern talking to? The fact that none of the tribunal members could meet her eyes was answer enough. While you were all busy being very civilized and very concerned, Casey continued, the Krillians were busy turning human children into labor for their mining operations. But hey, at least the paperwork was in order. This was the point where a normal defendant would have been removed from the courtroom for contempt. Casey Morgan was not a normal defendant, and more importantly, everyone in the room was beginning to suspect that she wasn't actually the one on trial here. So there I was, Casey said, settling back into her story with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting 18 months to tell it properly. Retired, running a small bar in Montana, thinking my war-fighting days were behind me. I was actually pretty good at the whole civilian thing, too. Made excellent burgers, never started fights with the customers. Well, not unless they really deserved it. And I'd only accidentally intimidated 3 health inspectors. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested those health inspectors had probably needed therapy afterward. Then Captain Hendricks shows up with his little alien entourage, looking like someone had told him to recruit the devil herself, but he'd misplaced the phone number for hell. The courtroom was quiet now, the kind of quiet that happens when everyone realizes they're about to hear something they probably didn't want to know, but couldn't possibly look away from. See, the thing about humans, Casey said, beginning to pace again in that way that made professional soldiers check their weapons, is that we don't really believe in impossible. We believe in difficult, sure. Expensive, absolutely. Going to require a lot of coffee and possibly some profanity. Well, that's just Tuesday. But impossible? That's just another word for hasn't been done yet. She stopped pacing and turned to face Ambassador Thexmore directly. Captain Hendricks explained the situation. 2.3 million humans enslaved. Krillian expansion continuing unopposed. Galactic community wringing their tentacles and making concerned noises, but not actually doing anything useful. Then he offered me a ship, one ship, and told me to go solve the problem. One ship, Administrator Kell repeated, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd just been told that gravity was actually optional on Tuesdays. Against the entire Krillian fleet? Well, Casey said, shrugging like she'd just been asked to pick up milk from the store, they did give me a crew. The pause that followed was pregnant with the kind of dread that comes from realizing that someone is about to explain exactly how they'd managed to accomplish the impossible, and that the explanation was probably going to make everyone else feel very, very stupid. Rico Santos, Casey began, counting off on her fingers. Hotshot pilot with authority issues and a tendency to treat space combat like it was some kind of extreme sport. Mika Petrov, engineer who could make a toaster achieve faster-than-light travel if you gave her enough coffee and stopped asking stupid questions about physical laws and thermodynamics. And Duncan McCready, we called him Boom, for reasons that became apparent the first time someone asked him to solve a problem quietly. She paused, considering. Actually, they became apparent before that. He introduced himself by accidentally blowing up the recruitment center's parking lot. General Vask leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally spotted a flaw in the defense's argument. 4 humans against a fleet that had conquered 18 systems? That's not strategy. That's suicide. Casey's laugh was the sound of someone who'd heard that particular objection before and found it adorable. See, that right there is why you never understood humans, she said, shaking her head with genuine amusement. You looked at those numbers and saw impossible odds. We looked at those same numbers and saw a target-rich environment. The silence that followed was the kind that happens right before someone realizes they've been thinking about the problem completely wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself again, Casey continued, settling back into her chair like she was getting comfortable for the really good part of the story. First, I had to meet my crew, and more importantly, they had to meet me. Her smile took on the quality of a fond memory, mixed with the promise of impending violence. Turns out, Hendricks had told them they'd be working with humanity's most decorated military officer. What he hadn't mentioned was that I'd earned those decorations by being too stubborn to die and too creative to fight fair. She looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of beings who represented the military might of 43 different species, each convinced of their own tactical superiority. The Krillians made the same mistake you're all making right now, Casey said, her voice carrying the gentle patience of someone explaining a very important lesson to people who probably wouldn't live long enough to benefit from it. They assumed that just because we were new to the galaxy, we didn't know how the game was played. The pause that followed was filled with the kind of tension that comes from realizing that the game everyone thought they understood had just revealed entirely new rules. What they didn't realize, Casey continued, her smile taking on the sharp edge that had made enemy commanders surrender rather than face her in battle, was that humans don't play games. She stood up again, and this time the movement carried the fluid grace of a predator who'd finally decided to stop pretending to be harmless. We rewrite them. The first thing you need to understand about human military tactics, Casey said, settling into the story like someone getting comfortable before explaining why the house was on fire and how it wasn't technically her fault, is that we don't actually have any. The tribunal exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey confusion, skepticism, and the growing suspicion that they were missing something very important. Oh, we have manuals, Casey continued, waving her hand dismissively. Lots of manuals. thick ones, with important-sounding names and diagrams that make everything look very official and scientific. But here's the thing about humans and manuals. We mostly use them as suggestions. She paused, letting that sink in. See, every other species in this galaxy fights the same way. You've got your formations, your standard operating procedures, your time-tested strategies that have been refined over thousands of battles. Very predictable, very civilized, very boring. Ambassador Thexmore's 6 arms performed what could only be described as indignant jazz hands. Military doctrine exists for a reason. Order, discipline, proven tactics. Proven against who? Casey interrupted, her tone carrying the gentle patience of someone explaining to a child why touching the stove was a bad idea. Against other people who read the same manuals, who follow the same rules, who think the same way. That's not strategy, Ambassador. That's elaborate choreography. She stood up and began pacing again, but this time her movement had the quality of a predator that had stopped pretending to be tame. The Krillian prison stations were fortresses, Casey continued. Impregnable, they called them. Shielded against every known form of attack. Defended by automated systems that could calculate and counter any standard military approach within nanoseconds. General Vask leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone who thought he'd spotted the flaw in the story. Then how did you possibly— We applied for jobs, Casey said simply. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone in the room simultaneously realizes they've been thinking about the problem completely wrong. Mika whipped up some fake identification papers. Turns out Krillian security systems are very sophisticated when it comes to military threats, but they'd never considered the possibility that someone might want to infiltrate their stations by pretending to be janitors. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made career military officers reconsider their life choices. Rico flew us in using a garbage hauler, not disguised as a garbage hauler, an actual garbage hauler, because apparently the one thing scarier to Krillian station commanders than enemy warships is missing their waste disposal schedule. Administrator Kell made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been the noise someone makes when they're choking on their own disbelief. You infiltrated their most secure facilities by taking out the trash? Well, Casey said, considering this, we also brought them lunch. Turns out Krillian guards get very friendly when you show up with food, especially when that food is spiced with a few special ingredients. The pause that followed was pregnant, with the kind of dread that comes from realizing that someone is about to explain how they'd weaponize the cafeteria. See, humans have been playing with capsaicin for thousands of years, Casey continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a particularly cherished family recipe. We put it on everything: pizza, ice cream, breakfast cereal, you name it. To us, it's just flavor. To Krillians. She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Their digestive systems, she continued with the satisfaction of someone who'd done her homework, are not designed for what they very politely described as thermal warfare. Turns out, when your entire security force is incapacitated by what humans consider mild salsa, your impregnable fortress becomes significantly less impregnable. General Vask made a sound that might have been outrage, or might have been the noise a filing cabinet makes when it's having an existential crisis. You committed chemical warfare with lunch? Now, Casey said, waving her finger with the gentle reproach typically reserved for children who'd been caught sneaking cookies before dinner. That's a very serious accusation. Chemical warfare implies intent to cause permanent harm. We were just sharing our culture. The fact that she could deliver this line without even the ghost of a smile was probably the most terrifying thing anyone in the courtroom had witnessed all day. Besides, she continued, that was just the appetizer. The main course came when we started broadcasting Earth music on all Krillian military frequencies. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ambassador Thexmore's 6 arms performing what could only be described as a symphony of confusion. You're familiar with psychological warfare, I assume? Casey asked, addressing the tribunal with the tone of someone conducting a very basic educational seminar. The use of sound, imagery, and information to demoralize enemy forces? Nods all around. This, at least, was familiar territory. Well, Casey said, her smile taking on the quality of someone about to deliver a punchline that had been 18 months in the making. We took that concept and ran with it. Rico had the brilliant idea to start with death metal, something called Cannibal Corpse, which I'm told is very popular among human teenagers and very disturbing to anyone with sensitive hearing. She paused, savoring the memory. The Krillians lasted about 30 minutes before they started begging us to stop, so naturally we switched to bagpipes. If there was a sound that could adequately describe the collective reaction of 43 different species simultaneously experiencing horror, regret, and the dawning realization that they'd severely underestimated human creativity, it probably would have involved more tentacles and significantly less dignity. Traditional Scottish war music, Casey continued, completely ignoring the fact that several tribunal members appeared to be having what could charitably be called emotional breakdowns, played at volumes that would make a heavy metal concert seem like a lullaby. We broadcast it continuously for 16 hours straight. Administrator Kell found her voice first, though it came out as more of a squeak than actual speech. 16 hours? We would have gone longer, Casey said, with the regret of someone who'd been forced to end a particularly enjoyable game early. But the Krillian Fleet Commander Byraxis, lovely fellow, very polite for someone who'd been enslaving children, requested a meeting to discuss terms. She settled back into her chair, with the satisfaction of someone who'd just successfully explained why the laws of physics were more like guidelines. The negotiation was brief. He offered to return half the enslaved humans in exchange for stopping the music. I countered with a proposal to return all the humans, surrender the entire fleet, and submit to a full psychological evaluation to determine why anyone would think enslaving children was a good idea. The pause that followed was filled with the kind of tension that comes from realizing that the story was about to take a turn that would make everything else seem reasonable by comparison. He declined, Casey continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone who'd expected this outcome and planned accordingly. So we moved to Phase 2 of the operation. She stood up again, and this time her movement carried the fluid confidence of someone who'd just revealed their hand and was very pleased with what they were holding. We gave them a demonstration of human engineering ingenuity. The silence that followed was the kind that happens right before something very expensive explodes. Mika had been working on a little project during our approach, Casey said, beginning to pace with the enthusiasm of someone sharing their favorite hobby. See, Krillian ships are marvels of engineering. Very sophisticated, very efficient, very hackable, if you know what you're doing. She paused, letting that sink in. And Mika very much knew what she was doing. General Vask leaned forward with the expression of someone who just realized they were about to hear something that would haunt their dreams. What did you do to their fleet? Casey's smile was the kind that made experienced warriors seriously consider early retirement. We reprogrammed their entertainment systems. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ambassador Thexmore's 6 arms performing what appeared to be interpretive dance, expressing the concept of impending doom. Every ship in the Krillian fleet, Casey continued with the satisfaction of someone describing a particularly successful prank, suddenly found itself broadcasting the complete discography of a human musical group called Baby Shark, on infinite loop, at maximum volume, with no way to turn it off. If there was a single moment when the entire Galactic Tribunal realized that they'd been thinking about human warfare in completely the wrong terms, this was probably it. "The surrender," Casey said, settling back into her chair like someone who'd just successfully explained why the universe worked the way it did, came approximately 6 hours later. Turns out, even hardened Krillian warriors have their breaking point, and apparently it's somewhere around the 50th repetition of Baby Shark, do 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 do. She looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of beings who represented the military might of 43 different species, each of whom was probably reconsidering everything they thought they knew about warfare. "And that," Casey said, her voice carrying the gentle finality of someone who'd just finished explaining why the house was on fire and why it was definitely someone else's fault, "is how 4 humans with a garbage hauler and a really good sound system convinced 200 of the galaxy's most advanced warships to surrender without firing a single shot." The pause that followed was pregnant with the kind of realization that comes from understanding that everything you thought you knew about military strategy had just been revealed to be adorably quaint. "But wait," Casey said, her smile taking on the quality of someone who'd been saving the best part for last. "There's more." The silence in the courtroom had reached that special quality that happens when everyone realizes they've been asking the wrong questions and are about to get answers they really didn't want to hear. Casey Morgan sat back in her chair, looking like someone who'd just finished telling a particularly good joke and was waiting for the punchline to land. The fact that the punchline involved the systematic dismantling of everything the galactic community thought they knew about warfare only made her expression more satisfying. "So," Administrator Kell said, her voice carrying the tone of someone trying very hard to maintain professional composure while everything around her collapsed into chaos. "You're claiming that you defeated the Krillian fleet without actually destroying it." "Oh, I'm not claiming anything," Casey said, her smile taking on the quality of someone who'd been saving the best part for last. "I'm stating facts. The Krillian fleet surrendered. Every ship, every crew member, every single one of the 200 vessels that you all seem to think I genocided out of existence." She paused, letting that sink in. "Which brings us to the interesting question of why you're all so convinced they're dead." The pause that followed was the kind that happens right before someone realizes they've been played by a master. "See, here's what really happened after the surrender," Casey continued, beginning to pace with the confidence of someone who'd been holding all the cards and was finally ready to play them. "We had 200 Krillian warships, thousands of crew members, and a very interesting conversation about what constitutes justice when dealing with a species that had just finished enslaving children for fun and profit. Ambassador Thexmore's 6 arms performed what could only be described as agitated semaphore. The Geneva Conventions clearly state—" "The Geneva Conventions," Casey interrupted, her voice carrying the gentle patience of someone explaining a very simple concept to a very slow student, "were written by humans for humans about human conflicts. They make certain assumptions about the nature of warfare and the treatment of prisoners that become problematic when dealing with species that consider child slavery a legitimate business model." She stopped pacing and turned to face the tribunal directly. So we improvised. The silence that followed was pregnant with the kind of dread that comes from realizing that someone very creative had been given a very difficult problem and unlimited time to solve it. Every Krillian crew member, Casey said, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing the solution to a particularly elegant puzzle, was given a choice. They could face trial for war crimes, slavery, and genocide, or they could accept an alternative form of justice. General Vask leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd just realized they were about to hear something that would require therapy to forget. What kind of alternative? Casey's smile was the kind that made seasoned warriors wake up in cold sweats. Rehabilitation. The word hung in the air like a sword that was taking its time deciding where to fall. See, the thing about Krillians, Casey continued, settling back into her explanation like someone describing a particularly successful home improvement project, is that they're not actually evil. They're just poorly educated. They've spent so many generations conquering weaker species that they'd forgotten what it was like to deal with someone who could fight back. She paused, considering. So we decided to teach them. Administrator Kell made a sound that might have been curiosity, or might have been the noise someone makes when they're trying very hard not to ask a question they don't want answered. Teach them what? Empathy, Casey said simply. Compassion. The value of life. Basic concepts like slavery is wrong and children are not acceptable mining equipment. You know, elementary stuff. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of 43 different species simultaneously trying to process what they'd just heard. We started with the classics, Casey continued, warming to her subject. Human literature, philosophy, art, a little Dickens to explain social responsibility, some Dostoevsky for the psychological complexity, Shakespeare for the moral ambiguity. Rico suggested adding some Disney movies for the lighter moments. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested the Disney movies had been particularly effective. The crew members who chose rehabilitation, Casey said, her voice taking on the tone of someone describing a surprisingly successful cooking experiment, spent 6 months in what we called cultural immersion therapy. They learned about human history, human values, and human approaches to conflict resolution. General Vask found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. You brainwashed them? Now that's a very loaded term, Casey said, wagging her finger with the gentle reproach typically reserved for children who'd been caught using words they didn't understand. We prefer educational rehabilitation. Very different thing. Brainwashing removes personality and free will. Education gives people the tools to make better choices. She paused, letting that distinction sink in. And they did make better choices. Remarkable ones, actually. Turns out, when you show a warrior species what they've been fighting for versus what they could be fighting for, they tend to have what humans call a change of heart. The courtroom was quiet now, but it was a different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when everyone realizes they've been looking at the problem from the wrong angle. So, where are they now? Administrator Kell asked, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was beginning to suspect the answer was going to be either very good news or very bad news, and couldn't decide which would be worse. Casey's smile took on the quality of someone about to deliver the punchline to a joke 18 months in the making. Oh, they're around, she said with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Fleet Commander Byraxis is running a refugee assistance program in the Outer Rim. Captain Thexaval started a school for war orphans, Lieutenant Zordon has become quite the advocate for prison reform. She settled back into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd just successfully explained why the universe worked better than anyone had realized. In fact, she continued, pulling out a small device that looked suspiciously like a recording unit, they've been very helpful in documenting exactly how the galactic community has been handling the Krillian situation. The silence that followed was the kind that happens right before someone realizes they've been walking into a trap for 18 months. See? The real war crime, Casey said, her voice taking on the sharp edge that had made enemy commanders surrender rather than face her in battle, wasn't what I did to the Krillian fleet. The real war crime was what you all did to every species the Krillians conquered before they met us. She stood up, and this time her movement carried the fluid grace of a predator who'd finally stopped pretending to be harmless. 18 systems, she said, beginning to pace with the measured steps of someone delivering a verdict. 43 different species, millions of sentient beings enslaved, murdered, or worse. And what did this galactic community do about it? The pause that followed was filled with the kind of silence that comes from knowing you're about to be judged and found wanting. You made trade deals, Casey continued, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone reading from a particularly damning legal document. You signed non-aggression pacts. You looked the other way while children were sold into slavery because it was more convenient than actually doing something about it. She stopped pacing and turned to face Ambassador Theximore directly. Your government, she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that made professional soldiers check their weapons, has been purchasing Krillian-mined minerals for the past 50 years. Minerals extracted by slave labor from conquered worlds. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ambassador Theximore's 6 arms performing what appeared to be the interpretive dance equivalent of a complete nervous breakdown. General Vask, Casey continued, turning to address the hegemony representative, your military has a mutual defense treaty with the Krillian Dominion. You've been providing them with weapons technology in exchange for territorial concessions. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made hardened criminals confess to crimes they didn't commit. Administrator Kell, your trade, Federation, has been laundering Krillian currency through 17 different shell corporations. Very sophisticated setup, really. Almost impossible to trace unless you happen to have access to surrendered Krillian financial records. The courtroom erupted into chaos, which was actually an improvement over the previous atmosphere of smug moral superiority. Casey waited for the noise to die down, which it eventually did, mostly because even outraged aliens eventually had to face the music. The evidence, she said, patting the recording device with the satisfaction of someone who'd just successfully completed a very difficult magic trick, has been broadcasting on all galactic news networks for the past 6 hours. Complete financial records, communication logs, treaty documents, everything. She looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of beings who represented 43 different species, each of whom was probably reconsidering their career choices. So, yes, Casey said, settling back into her chair with the finality of someone who'd just finished explaining why the house was on fire and exactly who was responsible. I committed a war crime. I let the Krillians live long enough to testify about who was really running the show. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone realizes that the trial they thought they were attending had just become their own judgment day. The Krillian fleet, Casey continued, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone delivering a final verdict, is currently providing security for refugee settlements and former slave colonies. Their ships have been retrofitted as medical vessels and supply transports. Their crews have become teachers, healers, and advocates for the very people they once enslaved. She stood up one final time, and her movement carried the fluid confidence of someone who'd just successfully rewritten the rules of an entire galaxy. "They said I was a war criminal," Casey said, delivering the line with the perfect timing that had made her legendary. "And they were right. My crime was showing mercy to people who didn't deserve it, and giving them the chance to become something better than what they were." She walked toward the exit, pausing at the door to deliver her final line. "You're all still alive," she said, her voice carrying the quiet promise of someone who'd just explained exactly how much trouble everyone was in. "Consider that mercy." Ambassador Thexismore found their voice first, though it came out strangled with desperation. "Wait! You can't just leave. There are protocols, procedures." Casey turned back, and her expression carried the amused patience of someone watching a child throw a tantrum about bedtime. "Protocols? Like the ones you followed when you authorized weapons shipments to active slave traders? Or maybe the procedures you used when filing reports that conveniently omitted the part about child labor camps?" She stepped back into the room, and the air itself seemed to grow colder. "Here's a protocol for you, Ambassador. In approximately 36 hours, every major news network in the galaxy will be broadcasting detailed interviews with former Krillian slaves. Children who can describe, in excruciating detail, exactly which galactic representatives visited their mining facilities and how much those representatives paid for the privilege of pretending not to see anything." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone simultaneously realizes they're about to become the most hated beings in galactic history. "General Vask," Casey continued, turning her attention to the hegemony representative, who was currently resembling a filing cabinet having an existential crisis, "your military advisors will be particularly interested in Lieutenant Zordan's testimony. Turns out, he kept very detailed records of every weapon transaction, every tactical consultation, and every time your officers complimented the Krillians on their efficient labor management." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made career politicians seriously consider early retirement to very distant planets. "But perhaps the most interesting testimonies," Casey said, beginning to pace again with the measured steps of someone who'd been saving the best for last, "will come from the Krillian accountants. Fascinating people. Accountants. Very detail-oriented. They kept meticulous records of every bribe, every kickback, every under-the-table deal that kept the galactic community's hands clean, while their bank accounts got very, very dirty." Administrator Kell made a sound that might have been a whimper, or might have been the noise someone makes when they realize their entire career has just been revealed to be a criminal enterprise. "The Trade Federation had no knowledge of—" "The Trade Federation," Casey interrupted, her voice carrying the sharp precision of someone reading from a particularly damning legal document, "processed over 2 billion credits in Krillian blood money through your humanitarian aid programs. Very creative accounting, really. Hard to trace unless you happen to have access to the complete financial records of a surrendered enemy fleet." She paused, letting the implications sink in like poison through water. Every credit traced, every transaction documented, every signature matched to its owner. The Krillians were very thorough record keepers. Professional pride, I suppose. The courtroom had gone beyond silence into something approaching the absence of sound itself, as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Oh, and one more thing," Casey said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who'd just remembered a particularly amusing detail. Rico wanted me to mention that he's been live streaming this entire trial on something called Galactic Tube. Apparently, it's been quite popular. Current viewer count is just over 800 million and climbing. If there was a sound that could adequately describe 43 different species simultaneously realizing that their political careers had just ended in real time, it probably would have involved more screaming and significantly less dignity. The comments section, Casey continued with the satisfaction of someone describing a particularly successful fireworks display, has been very educational. Turns out, when you give ordinary citizens access to the complete financial records of their governments, they have some very strong opinions about where their tax money has been going. She checked her watch with the casual air of someone who had dinner reservations and a galaxy to revolutionize. I'd estimate you have about 12 hours before the first governments start falling. Maybe 18, if you're lucky, and the protests take a while to organize. But honestly, after seeing how fast information travels these days, I wouldn't count on it. In the silence that followed, 43 different species sat in judgment of themselves, and found the verdict considerably less comfortable than they'd expected. The trial was over. The real work was just beginning. And somewhere in the Outer Rim, a reformed Krillian fleet commander was teaching former slave children how to read, while their former captors learned what it meant to be human. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected. But then again, humans had never been particularly good at following other people's scripts.